In 1856, on a Mississippi plantation, a 9-year-old enslaved girl by the name of Sara Sutton was buried alive. 3 days went by, and she managed to claw her way out from her grave. The events that followed transformed Blackwood Plantation into the most dreaded location throughout the entire South. It became a story murmured in hushed tones, but never openly discussed. A narrative of death and retribution that defied explanation and that everyone wished to erase from memory. This here is that story. It was August 1856, over at Blackwood Plantation in Mississippi. The heat was something alive, pushing down on everything, making it a struggle to breathe, to think, to just keep living. The cotton fields stretched out, endless and white, under a sky so intensely blue it hurt to look directly at it. The plantation spanned 300 acres, its wealth constructed on the backs of people who possessed nothing, not even their own selves. The owner was Margaret Sutton, a widow of 48 years who had taken over when her husband passed in 1852. Margaret was tall and lean, with gray eyes that seemed to constantly stare and a mouth that rarely curved into a smile. She governed the plantation with an iron grip, driven to show that a woman could handle such an operation just as effectively as any man, perhaps even better. She kept thorough records of every cost, every cotton bale, every enslaved person along with their assigned value. To Margaret's way of thinking, the plantation was simply a business operation. The individuals laboring there were simply inventory, and nothing beyond that. Before we move ahead with this remarkable story about Sara, make sure to leave a comment letting us know which city you're tuning in from, and also hit that subscribe button for the channel. It's your backing that allows these narratives to remain alive. Let's get back to it. In that year of 1856, a healthy grown male slave had a price tag around $1,200. A robust woman might be valued somewhere between $800 and $1,000. Children came in at a lower valuation, with their worth going up as they got older and demonstrated they could handle work. Margaret's record book showed Sara Sutton at a value of $250, which was less than a quarter of what an adult laborer was worth. Margaret saw this as being generous. The majority of plantation owners would put a sickly child's worth at $100 or maybe even less. Some would have sold Sara down to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where the time a person could expect to live was counted in years rather than decades, places where workers perished so rapidly they needed constant replacement. The surname Sara Sutton carried, which was Margaret's last name, came not from any family tie, but because she was owned property. Her birth happened on that plantation in 1847. Her mother was a woman named Ruth, who had been valued at $900 in the ledger kept by Margaret's husband. Ruth died bringing Sara into this world, which decreased the plantation's assets by that $900 and brought in only $250 as a replacement. Looking at it from a business standpoint, Sara being born represented a net loss of $650. Margaret's husband had made a note of this in his records, and his displeasure was obvious. Right from her very first breath, there was something different about Sara. Even as a baby she was tiny, weighing barely 5 pounds. Her growth was slow, and no matter how much she ate, she stayed thin. Her skin was lighter compared to the other enslaved children, which hinted that her father was a white man, though nobody ever talked about who that might have been. There were whispers it could have been Margaret's deceased husband, but those whispers never lasted very long. Asking dangerous questions had a tendency to get people sold off, or worse. By the time she reached 9, Sara stood only 4 foot tall and likely weighed around 50 pounds. She gave the appearance of being 6 rather than 9. She had large, dark eyes that seemed too wise for her youthful face, like she'd witnessed things no child ever should. She hardly ever spoke. When words did come from her, her voice was so faint people had to lean in close to catch what she said. She never joined in play with the other kids, never ran or laughed or sang the songs they'd sing in the quarters after dark. She just did her work slowly and carefully, trying to remain as unnoticed as possible. Margaret referred to her as the feeble one and recorded in her ledger that Sara's worth might need to be revised down to $150 if she failed to show improvement. The overseer, a brutal individual named Coleman Briggs, called her useless and used other, worse names. Briggs was 35, built like a bull with hands that had shattered bones and a whip he employed far too frequently. He was paid $60 monthly along with room and board, making him one of the best compensated overseers in Yazoo County. He'd been at Blackwood for 6 years, securing his role through a combination of cruelty and getting results. Briggs held the belief that enslaved people were like animals requiring taming, and he took satisfaction in his ability to crush even the most resilient spirits. Across 3 counties, he'd built a reputation as an overseer who could turn any plantation profitable by squeezing maximum output from the workers. His ways were harsh, but they got results, at least for a while. Across his 6 years at Blackwood, cotton output had risen by 40%. That he'd also buried 23 workers in that same time frame, with 7 of them being children, was viewed as a normal cost of conducting business. Sara, though, left him puzzled. You couldn't break someone who never put up a fight. You couldn't instill terror in someone who already appeared frightened of everything. You couldn't spur on someone who seemed to have surrendered to life before it had truly started. So he just pushed her to work harder. Drove her past what her small body could endure, hoping she'd either get tougher or simply die. To him, it made no difference. As he saw it, she was just a drain on food and resources, consuming more than she contributed, dragging down the plantation's overall efficiency. The other enslaved folks at Blackwood observed Sara with a blend of pity and aggravation. An elderly woman named Esther, who had been on the plantation for 40 years and was now valued at only $150 because of her age and waning strength, made an effort to watch over Sara when she could. Esther had been bought in 1816 for $600, thought of as prime breeding material at age 20. Across 25 years, she had birthed 11 children. 8 had been sold off to other places. 3 had passed away during childhood. Through her children, she'd earned the plantation thousands of dollars in value. Yet now, old and worn out, she was worth hardly more than the sickly child she attempted to shield. Esther would sneak Sara extra food when she could, although food was strictly rationed and watched. Workers got approximately 1 peck of cornmeal per week, 3 to 4 lbs of salted pork or bacon, and sometimes extras like molasses or vegetables. This diet, figured to cost the plantation around 20 cents per person daily, was meant to give just enough calories to keep workers functioning, but not comfortable. Esther would give Sara portions from her own rations, assist her with the tougher chores when nobody was looking, hold her during the nights when Sara woke up screaming from nightmares she'd never discuss. Esther said Sara brought to mind a bird with a broken wing, alive still but unable to fly, just waiting for something to end its misery. She mentioned to the other women in the quarters that Sara wouldn't live to see 15. The girl was too feeble, too delicate, not cut out for this existence. Better she go to God sooner rather than later, before life crushed whatever little spirit she had remaining. The other women would nod with sadness, having witnessed far too many children die to dispute that reasoning. From their experience, death could sometimes be the kindest thing to happen to an enslaved child. There was a younger man called Daniel, maybe 20 years old, listed at $1,200 in Margaret's book. He was strong and smart, justifying his high price, with years of productive work still ahead. He'd been born right on the plantation, the child of 2 valued workers, and had grown into precisely the kind of asset Margaret prized. During peak season, he could pick 200 pounds of cotton daily. He could mend equipment. He could read numbers and keep basic records, which made him valuable for tasks beyond just field work. Daniel often worked near Sara out in the fields. He'd attempt to assist her, carry her cotton sack when it grew too heavy, take over her row when she lagged behind. But Briggs observed everything, and helping another person meant both would face punishment. Briggs understood that solidarity among enslaved people posed a threat. Workers who aided each other might begin viewing themselves as a community with shared concerns, not merely individual assets. So he made certain to stamp out any signs of cooperation, keeping everyone isolated and afraid. Still, Daniel attempted to help. He just couldn't stop himself. Something about Sara's quiet suffering touched something deep within him, made him angry at the unfairness of everything in a manner that was perilous for an enslaved man to feel. His mother had advised him to keep his head down, to feel grateful he was healthy and strong, to not expend emotion on things he couldn't alter. But watching Sara struggle day after day, watching this child exhaust herself to death for people who viewed her as worth less than a decent horse, made him want to fight back in ways that would surely get him killed. The cotton harvest period stretched from August through October. This was the busiest and most vital time of the year for Blackwood Plantation. The entire year's earnings hinged on getting the cotton picked, processed, and sent off to market. Back in 1856, cotton was selling for about 11 cents per pound. A capable worker picking 150 pounds daily generated roughly $16.50 worth of cotton each day. Across a 90-day harvest season, that one worker could bring in almost $1,500 in revenue. Subtract the yearly expense of feeding, housing, and clothing that worker, around $73, and the profit margin was obvious. This is the reason plantation owners pushed workers so hard during harvest. This is why they calculated everything down to the last penny. This is why a child like Sara, who could only manage 30 or 40 pounds daily, producing maybe $3 or $4 worth of cotton, barely covering her own upkeep, was considered a drawback. In the cold arithmetic of slavery, she didn't make financial sense. She was inventory that wasn't increasing in value, that was actually costing more to maintain than she produced. Each enslaved person at Blackwood was required to pick between 150 and 200 pounds of cotton per day. Adults who picked less faced consequences, typically whipping, occasionally something worse. Briggs kept meticulous records, weighing each person's cotton at day's end, logging the amounts, comparing them to the required quotas. Those who surpassed their quotas occasionally got minor rewards, an extra bit of food, an afternoon off on Sunday, a word of acknowledgement. Those who fell short faced penalties that grew more severe with each failure. Children under 10 were supposed to pick at minimum 75 pounds daily. Sara had never once reached this quota. On her best days, she maybe got to 40. Most days, it was nearer to 30. Every single day she fell short. Margaret cut her food rations by an amount matching her shortfall. If she picked 40 pounds rather than 75, she'd receive about half the rations that night. The reasoning was straightforward. If you don't produce enough to cover your food costs, you get less food. That this set off a downward cycle where underfed workers became weaker and less productive, resulting in more food cuts, which caused more weakness, didn't concern Margaret. The weak were meant to perish. That was simply nature's way. That was how you cultivated strong stock. Briggs added his own punishments. He'd make Sara labor through meal breaks. He'd put her on the hottest, most challenging rows, stand over her criticizing, mocking, occasionally cuffing her on the back of the head when she moved too slow. He told her she was useless, that she was stealing from the plantation, that she ought to be grateful Mrs. Sutton didn't just sell her off to the sugar fields where she'd be dead within a year. The day August 15, 1856, started like every other. The sun came up hot and fierce, the sky already bright by 5 a.m. when the bell sounded, summoning everyone to the fields. Sara pulled herself from the small cabin she shared with Esther and 5 other women. That cabin measured around 16 by 20 feet, accommodating 7 individuals. Each person had roughly 46 square feet of space, about the same as a modern jail cell. There were no windows in that cabin, just gaps between the boards for air. No furniture except rough sleeping platforms, no privacy, no comfort at all. Sara hadn't slept well. Sleep never came easily for her. Her body ached constantly now. A steady pain in her bones and muscles that never seemed to stop. She'd been coughing more lately, a dry hack that made her chest hurt and sometimes brought up specks of blood. Esther said it was the cotton dust. Said plenty of children got sick from inhaling it day after day, year after year. Those tiny fibers got into your lungs and never left, causing ongoing irritation and infection. Some people recovered. Most didn't. Esther had witnessed it happen dozens of times across 40 years. A child would start coughing, would grow weaker, would waste away over months or years until they simply stopped breathing. That morning, Sara stumbled out into the pre-dawn darkness and got in line with the others walking to the fields. Nobody spoke much in the morning. Everyone was too exhausted, too hungry, too focused on just getting through another day. They walked without a word, like ghosts moving through the gray light, heading toward another day of brutal labor under a brutal sun for the benefit of people who saw them as livestock. By noon, Sara had maybe picked 15 pounds of cotton. Her small fingers, cut and bleeding from the sharp bowls that tore skin with every handful, moved as fast as she could make them, but she was just so slow. Each bowl required both hands to open and extract the cotton without leaving any behind, stuffing it into the sack that dragged behind her, growing heavier with each row completed. Her back screamed in pain from constantly bending over. The sun was unrelenting, beating down with a heat that made the air shimmer and dance. She'd been given 1 cup of water at sunrise and wouldn't receive another until sunset, 12 hours later. This was the usual practice during harvest season. Water breaks consumed time that could be spent picking. Margaret had calculated that permitting water breaks cut daily productivity by about 8%. Consequently, workers got water twice daily, morning and evening, and were expected to manage. That people sometimes collapsed from heat and dehydration was regrettable but deemed acceptable. The cost of lost productivity from water breaks exceeded the occasional cost of a dead worker. Sarah's mouth was so parched her tongue stuck to her teeth. She felt dizzy, like the world was tilting, like the ground wasn't quite where it ought to be. Her vision kept blurring. She had to pause and shut her eyes, breathe deeply, resist the urge to simply collapse in the dirt and not rise again. But lying down meant punishment. Meant Briggs would show up with his whip or his fists. Meant less food that night. So she kept working, kept picking, her small hands moving slower and slower as the heat and exhaustion took their toll. Briggs rode through the fields on his horse around 1 p.m., checking on workers, counting the filled sacks. He had a small scale with him, would randomly weigh sacks to ensure people weren't adding dirt or rocks, something desperate workers sometimes resorted to. He also had his whip coiled on his saddle and a pistol at his hip. That pistol was loaded. He'd used it twice in 6 years, shooting workers who attempted to run. Both died. Both deaths were officially ruled as justified self-defense. A slave trying to escape was legally considered to be stealing themselves, and using deadly force to stop theft was allowed. When Briggs reached Sarah's row, he dismounted and grabbed her nearly empty sack. He hefted it, his expression darkening. 15 pounds. In 8 hours, you only managed 15. His voice carried across the field, loud and angry, intended for everyone to hear. Other workers stopped to watch, dreading what would follow, yet unable to look away. They'd witnessed this scene many times before with different children. It always ended the same way. Sarah stared at the ground, swaying slightly. She whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm trying my best." Her voice was so quiet Briggs had to lean closer to catch it. This angered him even more. He despised when they were so submissive, when they wouldn't even fight back enough to make punishment satisfying. Your best. Your best gives us 15 pounds. Do you have any idea what you cost this plantation? What Mrs. Sutton pays to keep your worthless mouth fed? He grabbed her arm, yanking her upright and shaking her. 20 cents a day. That's the cost to keep you alive. 20 cents daily for food, housing, and the clothes on your back. You know what 15 pounds of cotton is worth? $1.65. You know how many days it takes you to earn enough to cover just 1 day of food? About 8 days. You're stealing from this plantation. You're stealing food from people who work hard, who earn their keep. You're a thief. The math was accurate, but intentionally misleading. It overlooked the fact that Sarah had been forced into this labor, that she was 9 years old, that she was sick and underfed. It ignored that she never asked to be born into slavery, never agreed to this arrangement, had no choice in any of it. But none of that mattered to Briggs. According to his worldview, enslaved people existed to generate profit. Those who didn't produce enough lacked value and thus had no right to complain about their treatment. Briggs dragged Sarah to the center of the field where everyone could witness. This was standard procedure. Punishment was meant to be public, to serve as a warning to others, to maintain fear and control. He pulled out his whip, a braided leather thing about 5 feet long that could strip skin from flesh with a single strike. Maybe pain will motivate you. Maybe if your back hurts worse than your arms, you'll work faster to make it stop. Esther started forward from where she'd been working 3 rows over, but Daniel grabbed her arm, holding her back. His eyes were filled with anguish, but he shook his head. Getting involved would just mean 2 people getting whipped instead of 1. Or worse. They'd all learned this lesson before. You couldn't save everyone. Sometimes you couldn't save anyone. All you could do was survive and hope tomorrow would be better, though it rarely was. Briggs raised the whip high, his arm pulling back for maximum force. Sara stood perfectly still, not running, not crying, simply waiting for the pain she knew was coming. She'd been whipped before, many times. She knew what it felt like. How the skin would split and burn. How the blood would run down her back. How she'd have to sleep on her stomach for days while the wounds tried to heal, often getting infected in the filthy conditions of the cabin. She knew all of this and accepted it because what other choice did she have? But before Briggs could bring that whip down, Sara collapsed. She just fell to the ground like someone had cut her strings, like a puppet with nobody holding it up. Her eyes rolled back in her head, showing only whites. Her body went completely limp, folding in on itself as she crumpled into the dirt. She didn't catch herself, didn't put her hands out, just fell like something dead. Briggs stood there a moment, whip still raised, confused by this turn of events. He kicked her with his boot, not gently. Get up. Get up right now, or I'll make it worse. I'll whip you until you can't walk. But Sara didn't move. Didn't respond at all. Her chest was moving, but barely. Shallow breaths that seemed too weak to sustain life. Her skin was pale, almost gray. Her lips were turning blue. Daniel broke free from his row and ran over before anyone could stop him. He knew he'd be punished for this, but he didn't care. He knelt beside Sara and put his hand on her chest, feeling for her heartbeat. It was there, but wrong, irregular, and weak like it might stop at any moment. She's not breathing right. Something's really wrong with her. She needs the doctor. She's really sick. Briggs kicked Daniel hard in the ribs, knocking him aside. Get back to work or you'll join her on the ground. But Daniel stayed where he was, protecting Sara's body with his own. She's dying. Can't you see that? She's dying right here in the dirt. At least let her die somewhere with shade. At least give her that much. Briggs looked at Sara's still form and cursed under his breath. If she died in the field from a whipping, there would be questions. Margaret didn't like losing property, even worthless property worth only $250. There would be investigations, reports, maybe problems with the law. If someone made a fuss about it, better to let the doctor deal with it. Let her die somewhere out of sight, somewhere the blame could be deflected. He called for 2 other workers to carry Sara to the plantation house. Take her to Dr. Merritt. Let him figure out what's wrong with her. And you, he pointed at Daniel, get back to work. I'll deal with you later. Daniel watched as they carried Sara away. Her small body was so light she looked like she weighed nothing at all, like she was already a ghost. He had a terrible feeling he would never see her alive again. The plantation doctor was a man named Thomas Merritt, 72 years old, who'd been practicing medicine for 40 years. He charged Margaret $30 per year to be on call for medical issues at Blackwood. This worked out to about 8 cents per day, making him one of the cheaper expenses of running the plantation. It was easy money for minimal work. Most of his treatments involved bleeding patients, which required no expensive medicines, or giving them laudanum, which cost about $2 per bottle and could be stretched for months. Dr. Merritt wasn't particularly skilled, having received his medical training through a brief apprenticeship 30 years earlier rather than formal schooling. But in rural Mississippi in 1856, skilled doctors were rare and expensive. Doctors who would treat enslaved people at all were even rarer. Most proper physicians considered it beneath them to treat slaves, seeing it as veterinary work rather than real medicine. So plantation owners made do with men like Merritt, who asked few questions, kept poor records, and didn't care if their patients lived or died. They laid Sara on the floor of the doctor's room in the main house. Not on a bed or examination table, just the floor. The bed was for white patients. The floor was sufficient for enslaved people. Dr. Merritt examined her briefly, his movements slow and careless. He checked her pulse by pressing 2 fingers against her wrist. It was there, but weak and irregular, sometimes seeming to stop for several seconds before starting again. He listened to her chest by pressing his ear against her rib cage. He heard fluid in her lungs, a wet rattling sound that indicated pneumonia or something similar. He pulled back her eyelids and saw her eyes had rolled back, showing mostly white with just a sliver of brown visible. He checked her temperature by pressing his hand against her forehead. She was burning with fever, her skin hot and dry. He checked her hands and feet and found them cold, the blood retreating from her extremities as her body tried to preserve her core. This was a bad sign. It meant her body was shutting down, prioritizing vital organs over everything else, a desperate measure that often preceded death. Margaret stood in the doorway watching, her arms crossed, her face showing irritation rather than concern. This was an inconvenience, an interruption to her day. Well, what's wrong with her? Dr. Merritt stood up slowly, his knees creaking with age. She has pneumonia, I believe. Her lungs are full of fluid. Combined with exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition, and heat exposure, her body is failing. She's in what we call systemic collapse. Multiple organ systems shutting down simultaneously. Margaret's face showed no emotion. She'd heard similar diagnoses before. Workers died regularly on plantations. It was a normal part of doing business. Can you fix her? The question was asked the same way she might ask if he could fix a broken tool. Dr. Merritt shrugged, wiping his hands on his pants. I can try, but honestly, Mrs. Sutton, I'm not confident it would be successful. The medicine alone would cost about $5. Quinine for the fever, laudanum for the pain, perhaps some stimulants to strengthen her heart. The nursing care would take time away from more valuable workers. Someone would have to sit with her, give her water, keep her cool, monitor her condition. That's lost productivity. He paused, doing his own calculations. And even with treatment, I'd say her chances of survival are less than half. Probably closer to 1 in 3. She's been weak her whole life. This might just be nature taking its course. Sometimes the weak ones need to die so resources aren't wasted on them. That's just how the world works. Margaret did the math in her head quickly. $5 for medicine, perhaps another $5 in lost productivity from whoever had to nurse Sara. $10 total to maybe save a girl worth $250. But only if she recovered fully and became a productive worker, which seemed unlikely given her history. If she recovered but stayed weak, she might never be worth more than $150 or even $100, making the investment a loss. And there was a 2 in 3 chance she would die anyway, making the entire $10 wasted. The smart business decision was clear. Margaret had built Blackwood's profitability by making smart business decisions, by not letting sentiment interfere with economics. Don't waste the medicine, she said. Her voice was firm, final. Make her comfortable. If she dies, she dies. God's will. This was a common phrase among slaveholders, attributing deaths to divine providence rather than their own decisions. It made it easier to live with. Dr. Merritt nodded. He had expected this answer. He had given similar advice dozens of times, and Margaret had always taken it. Why waste resources on a failing asset? Better to cut your losses. He gave Sara a small dose of laudanum, maybe a quarter teaspoon, just enough to dull her pain slightly, but not enough to waste valuable medicine on someone unlikely to survive. Then he left her lying on the floor and went to have his dinner. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon on August 15, 1856. By 6 p.m., Sara's condition had worsened significantly. Her fever had spiked higher, her skin now so hot it was almost painful to touch. Her breathing had become even more shallow and irregular, sometimes stopping completely for 10 or 15 seconds before starting again with a wet, rattling gasp. She hadn't regained consciousness. She hadn't moved at all except for occasional twitches and convulsions as her body fought its losing battle. Dr. Merritt checked on her once more around 7 p.m. and shook his head with certainty. She'll be gone by morning, probably much sooner, maybe an hour or 2 at most. He told Betty, one of the house servants valued at $600, who served as a maid and occasional nurse, to watch the body and let him know when Sara passed so he could sign the death certificate. Betty sat on a stool in the corner, watching this child die, feeling helpless and sad, but not surprised. She had watched many people die over her 30 years at Blackwood. Death was common here, expected, almost routine. At 8:35 p.m., Sara Sutton stopped breathing. Her chest, which had been moving in those shallow, irregular breaths, went still. Betty waited a full minute watching, but there was no movement. She called for Dr. Merritt, who came down grumbling about being interrupted during his evening reading. He checked for a pulse in Sara's wrist. Nothing. He held a small hand mirror to her mouth, watching for fog from breath. The mirror stayed clear. He pressed his ear to her chest, listening for a heartbeat. Complete silence. Dr. Merritt pronounced Sara dead at 8:35 p.m. on August 15, 1856. Cause of death: pneumonia complicated by chronic weakness and multiple contributing factors. He recorded it carefully in his medical ledger where he kept records of births, deaths, and treatments at Blackwood. Sara Sutton became entry number 437 in that ledger, one of 38 deaths he had recorded in his 6 years serving the plantation. Most were children or elderly slaves. A few were adults who had been worked to death or died from accidents or disease. All were noted with the same clinical detachment, just facts and figures, dates and causes. Margaret was informed while she ate her dinner. She barely looked up from her roasted chicken and vegetables. Have them bury her behind the barn. No point wasting space in the cemetery, and do it quickly. This heat will make the body deteriorate rapidly. This was not unusual. Enslaved people who died were often buried quickly in unmarked graves, especially children, especially sick ones who hadn't been productive. They weren't considered worthy of the space or ceremony afforded to white people or even to valuable adult slaves who had earned some measure of respect through years of hard work. The cemetery Margaret referenced was reserved for white people and occasionally for extremely valuable or long-serving slaves who had been favorites of the family. It had proper headstones, maintained plots, regular care. The area behind the barn was different. It was where dead animals were buried, where broken equipment was discarded, where anything considered waste was dumped and forgotten. Burying Sara there was a final insult, a last statement about her worth. Coleman Briggs was given the task of organizing the burial. He picked 2 workers, James and Moses, gave them shovels, and told them to dig a hole 4 feet deep behind the barn. He didn't provide a coffin. Coffins cost money, at least $5 to $10, for even a basic pine box. That was money Margaret wouldn't waste on a child who had cost the plantation more than she produced. He just had them wrap Sara's body in an old piece of canvas that had once been used to cover cotton bales, but was now too damaged to be useful. The burial took less than an hour. James and Moses, both men in their 30s, dug the grave in silence, working quickly in the fading light. They had buried people before, too many people. The ground behind the barn was soft from previous burials, easy to dig. They dug down about 4 feet, creating a hole roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, just barely big enough for Sara's small body. They placed her in the ground, still wrapped in canvas, her face covered. No ceremony, no prayers, nothing. Briggs wouldn't allow it. Religious services for slaves had to be approved and supervised, and he wasn't going to waste time on a child who had been more trouble than she was worth. James and Moses filled the dirt back in, covering Sara's body, patting it down flat. By 10 p.m., it was finished. Sara Sutton was in the ground, 4 feet of Mississippi dirt between her and the world, forgotten before the dirt had fully settled. Esther watched from the quarters, tears running down her face. She had wanted to say goodbye, wanted to wash Sara's body properly according to the traditions her own grandmother had taught her, wanted to say a prayer over her grave. But she hadn't been allowed. None of the enslaved people had been allowed to participate in the burial. It was done quickly, efficiently, without sentiment or respect. Just another dead slave, another loss to be noted in the ledger and forgotten. Daniel stood beside Esther, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth hurt. His hands were balled into fists at his sides. She deserved better, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't express more openly. She deserved so much better than this. Esther nodded, wiping her eyes. They all deserve better, child. Every single person who dies in this place deserves better. But this is the world we live in. This is what they think we're worth. Less than animals, less than dirt. They stood there until full dark, watching the unmarked grave, saying their own quiet prayers, mourning a child they had known for 9 years who had never been allowed to truly live. Then they went back to their cabin because the work bell would ring again at 5 a.m. and they had to be ready. Life at Blackwood Plantation continued. The cotton didn't stop growing because a child died. The work didn't pause for grief. Everything just moved forward like Sara had never existed. The next day, August 16th, life returned to normal. People went to the fields. Cotton was picked. Quotas were enforced. Margaret noted Sara's death in her ledger with a simple entry. Sara Sutton, age 9, died August 15, 1856. Loss of asset value, $250. She would claim it as a business loss on her taxes, perhaps reducing her burden by a few dollars. The grave behind the barn was unmarked and already starting to sink slightly as the dirt settled and compressed. August 17th passed the same way. Work, heat, exhaustion, sleep, repeat. Nobody talked about Sara. Talking about the dead was considered bad luck. And besides, what was there to say? Another child had died. It happened all the time. You mourned if you could. You moved on because you had to, and you hoped you wouldn't be next. But on August 18th, 3 days after Sara's burial, something happened that would change everything at Blackwood Plantation. The night of August 18th was hot and still, the air heavy with moisture that promised rain, but never delivered. There was no breeze, no relief from the oppressive heat even after the sun went down. Most people at Blackwood were asleep by 9 p.m., exhausted from another brutal day of labor. The few who were still awake, sitting outside their cabins, trying to find some cooler air, heard it first. A sound that didn't belong. A scraping sound, like something digging or clawing, coming from the direction of the barn. At first, they thought it was an animal, maybe a dog or raccoon getting into something. But then the sound got louder, more deliberate, more purposeful. And the dogs, all 6 of them that lived around the plantation, started barking, all of them, all at once, in a way that made your skin crawl, in a way that spoke of primal fear rather than territorial aggression. This wasn't their normal barking at an intruder or another animal. This was different. This was the sound dogs make when they sense something fundamentally wrong, something that violates the natural order. They barked and howled, backing away from the barn, hackles raised, some of them trembling. One of the dogs urinated in fear, which dogs don't do unless they're absolutely terrified. James, one of the house servants, valued at $700, who often had night duties, grabbed a lantern and went to investigate. He called to the dogs to be quiet, but they wouldn't stop, wouldn't even come near him. They just stood at a distance, continuing their fear-crazed barking, looking towards something behind the barn that James couldn't see yet. He walked slowly around the building, holding the lantern high, his heart beating faster with each step, though he couldn't say why. The air felt wrong somehow, colder than it should be, heavy with something he couldn't name. He saw the graves first, 3 small mounds where people had been buried over the past 2 months. The dirt on 2 of them was undisturbed, settled and smooth. But the third one, the newest one, Sara's grave, was different. The dirt had been disturbed, more than disturbed. There was a hole coming up from below, like something had dug its way out from the inside. And as James got closer, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He saw something that made him drop the lantern, that made him scream louder than he had ever screamed in his life. A small hand, pale in the moonlight, sticking up out of the dirt. Fingers moving, grasping, pulling, and beneath the hand, a face covered in dirt, eyes open, mouth gasping for air. Sara Sutton was climbing out of her grave. James's scream cut through the night like a knife, waking half the plantation. People came running from all directions, from the slave quarters and the main house, carrying lanterns and torches, asking, "What's wrong? What happened? Why is James screaming like someone's being murdered? He couldn't answer. He just stood there pointing at the grave with a shaking hand. His mouth moving, but no words coming out. His eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Coleman Briggs arrived first from the overseer's house, pulling on his pants, carrying his rifle, ready for trouble. He pushed through the gathering crowd, cursing everyone for the disturbance, demanding to know what fool woke him up in the middle of the night. Then he saw what James was pointing at, and stopped dead in his tracks. His rifle lowered slowly. His face went pale in the torchlight. Behind him, more people gathered, enslaved workers and white staff members, all carrying lights, all pushing forward to see what caused such commotion. The crowd grew to 20, then 30, then 40 people, all standing in a semicircle around the grave site, all staring at something impossible, something that violated every natural law they understood about life and death. Sara Sutton was pulling herself up and out of her grave. Her movements were slow but deliberate, purposeful. Both hands now gripped the edge of the hole, her thin arms straining as she hauled herself upward. Dirt fell off her in clumps, cascading down the burial canvas that still partially wrapped her small body. Her